Hello everyone, we are on chapter 8 and we are on paragraph 7. So I'm going to get started. The philosophy of will I'm going to start over again. Hello everyone, we are on chapter 8 and we are on paragraph 7. So I'm going to get started. The philosophy of will can as little be called scientific as can the mysticism based on feeling, for both assert that the conceptual understanding of the world is inadequate. Both demand a principle of existence which is real, in addition to a principle which is ideal. To a certain extent this is justified, but since perceiving is our only means of apprehending these so-called real principles, the assertion of both the mysticism of feeling and the philosophy of will comes to the same thing as saying that we have two sources of knowledge, thinking and perceiving, the latter presenting itself as an individual experience in feeling and will. Since the results that flow from the one source, the experiences, cannot on this view be taken up directly into those that flow from the other source, thinking, the two modes of knowledge, perceiving and thinking, remain side by side without any higher form of mediation between them. Besides the ideal principle, which is accessible to knowledge, there is said to be a real principle which cannot be apprehended by thinking, but can yet be experienced. In other words, the mysticism of feeling and the philosophy of will are both forms of naive realism, because they subscribe to the doctrine that what is directly perceived is real. Compared with naive realism in its primitive form, they are guilty of the yet further inconsistency of accepting one particular form of perceiving, feeling, or will, respectively, as the one and only means of knowing reality, whereas they can only do this at all if they hold in general to the fundamental principle that what is perceived is real. But in that case, they ought to attach equal value for the purposes of knowledge also to external perception. And so paragraph 7 is summarized as follows. The mysticism of feeling and the philosophy of will are both forms of naive realism, because they subscribe to the view that what is perceived is real. They also believe that the conceptual understanding of the world is inadequate. There is an inconsistency of accepting one form of perceiving, feeling, and will as the one means of knowing reality, whereas they can only do this if they stick to the fundamental principle that what is real, that what is perceived is real. So basically, paragraph 7 is continuing on with what paragraph 6 was saying, and that is the philosophy of will and the philosophy of freedom both believe that the conceptual understanding of the world is inadequate, and obviously we know that according to Steiner's view that is not true, because the conceptual realm is something that is absolutely essential in the task of knowledge. They're both forms of naive realism as well, and they both subscribe to the doctrine that what is directly perceived is real. Okay, so he does point out that the mysticism of feeling and of the will and the philosophy of will are types of naive realism, and I just wanted to point out that they're just different variations of naive realism, and the truest form would be naive realism based on strictly on what we can perceive with our senses. If I can see an object, that's real. Just wanted to point that out. So let me just clarify again some more of 7. These two theories are inconsistent, and they only accept one form of perceiving. They either accept feeling or the will as the only means of viewing reality. And for Steiner, he believes that they should also place equal value to external perception as well, if they are to stay true to their principle that what is perceived is real. So for Steiner, as mentioned earlier, feeling and the will is something that can be perceived. Therefore, they cannot be sources of knowledge because they fall under the category of what we can perceive, and they're too narrow of a detail to make as something. So Steiner wants us to, step back and look at perceiving as a much broader term, and so these would fall under that category. So for him, yes, I mentioned that. So perceiving is something that for him encompasses a wide range of things. So that's basically what he's trying to point out in this paragraph. So I'm going to move on to the last paragraph, which is paragraph 8. The philosophy of will turns into metaphysical realism when it places the element of will even into these spheres of existence where it cannot be experienced directly, as it can in the individual subject. It assumes outside the subject a hypothetical principle for whose real existence the sole criterion is subjective experience. As a form of metaphysical realism, the philosophy of will is subject to the criticism made in the preceding chapter, in that it has to get over the contradictory stage inherent in every form of metaphysical realism, and must acknowledge that the will is a universal world process only insofar as it is ideally related to the rest of the world. In paragraph 8 is summarized as follows. The philosophy of will turns into metaphysical realism when it places the will into spheres of existence where it cannot be experienced directly. The will is subjective and is only universal when it is related ideally to the rest of the world. So for Steiner, as he mentions again, the philosophy of will ends up turning into metaphysical realism because it's not something that can be experienced directly as it can in individuals. So that basically means what he's saying is that the will is subjective because it just is. It's each person has their own will, and it's all very subjective. And for him, we can only recognize the will as a universal process when we permeate it with thinking, and from that extract concepts out of the will. And that's the only way it can be recognized as something that is universal. Otherwise, it's not, because it is subjective. So that's what he's pointing out in this paragraph. So I'm just going to leave it at that. We have the addition that I will discuss, but we're running out of time, so I want to make sure I explain the addition thoroughly. So that's all for today's session. So if you have any questions or comments, just send me a message. Have a good day. Bye.